Okay, welcome back to a different type of Bearded D20 video at an interesting thought experiment, and the whiteboard is still here. So the question came up the other day, and I began thinking about how my system would handle a game like Call of Duty Infinite Warfare. And so I began thinking about it, and I wanted to walk through some footage of the game's beginning here and how I would adapt it kind of on the fly without pre-writing a bunch of stuff to the system I'm working on, just to kind of show its flexibility with different things. So I've watched a little bit of it. So there's a couple things that we need to lay some ground rules for. And I think so in a, let's say, modern slash sci-fi game, uh, the goal is to shoot. Rare. All right. So, and this is a common trope that I see in any type of modern game where the game is about shooting, it is not about melee. So, when you get into a situation where you can melee, they do gamify this to some degree, but I don't think it's too uh, beyond the pale. Is Melee is basically a one shot. So, let's kind of quickly lay some rules here for. I don't know where that dot came from. Get out of here. All right. So, firearms. Well, let's back up a second. Ranged combat, single shot. So, the way ranged combat works by default right now, and technically you could if you had a rapid fire weapon, then it would work the same in the current version of the game, which is geared more towards sword and sorcery, as it would with uh, anything. So if you fire a bow in a modern setting, it's going to work the same mechanically as it does in the sword and sorcery with the version that's kind of geared towards that, if that makes sense. So you will make your uh, PC makes a proactive check with a ranged weapon. Let's say for the sake of the argument, they have a +1 to their proficiency. Proficiencies and that stuff's covered in other videos, and I don't want to. This is already going to get sidetracked. So let's say they have 1d12 plus 2d6 as their base, and we'll give them plus 1d6 for their proficiency. All right. I will quickly roll some dice. All right. So I got a 9, 6, 3, and a 1. Well, this is just a virtual dice roller on Discord. All right, for a 19. Even a beginning character, typically you're kind of looking for 16, 15 or 16 is kind of like the normal target number. And if you have a good stat, then you're going to be looking for 14. So just keep in mind 15 is kind of what we're going here. So 19 is a success. But it is not a critical hit because we just have a 9. So unless the target had 3 points of stagger, then this would not be a critical hit. So when you get a success, the target All right. So when you get a success with a ranged weapon, it means you shot very close to them, and basically they have time to react to move, but it's going to be kind of expensive for them. So the rate of movement though is standard across all ranged, and maybe this value will change, but I don't think so. And maybe by the end of this you'll see why. But this isn't really about single target. I feel like I need to explain how things work from the beginning in order to get to where we need to go at the end. All right, if this was a failure, maybe failure is the wrong word, but I'm using it here just because typically in games when you don't make your target number, you fail the thing. Very rarely in this system will nothing happen. There's always something that happens. It's just that failure is you're getting to where you want to go a lot slower. And it's more convenient for your adversaries. But basically with a failed, if this was failed, so say this instead. What if this was a 14 and it didn't pass? Then the target would only have to spend 2 endurance and they could move 1 space, or they'd have to roll armor. So just from this, you can kind of see if you can corner someone and they don't have a way to move, if you shoot them with a ranged weapon, uh, they don't have a lot of options. They're going to be rolling armor. Unless you have a shield, but that's a whole different ball of wax. We don't need to get into shields right this second. So, if this was a crit, if this was a 12, or the target had 3 stagger, they don't lose any endurance on a critical hit, because endurance is just target's ability to protect themselves, and in this case, they failed to do that. Either your aim was spot on, or more likely than not, the target was distracted after being attacked multiple times. So once you get, if it's a success and a crit, the target has no option to move, and you move straight onto rolling armor. And so when we get to, and this is for single shot ranged weapons, so all of kind of your traditional weapons, bows, crossbows, and that type of stuff, and all manner of primitive firearms that you typically see in fantasy games are all going to fall into this sort of single shot method of resolution. And the resolution is kind of the same with blasts, but the difference, I guess, if we take the reoccurring theme with blasts is that they all pretty much are going to have some amount of area of effect to them. And so the most common for modern weapons or any type of magic in the sword and sorcery is how will they handle blast type stuff. So if we have a character here with a modern weapon, and they're going to be firing a semi-auto, multiple rounds, or fully auto, then they're going to get if you're on the grid, it's going to be a 3-space wide, and then it'll be a line that just kind of goes off. And I don't really plan on giving this a range because I don't expect the types of encounters people to be doing with the system for the effective range of a modern firearm to really ever be a question. Whether or not you get hit is going to have way more to do with how much stagger you have, how much endurance you have, if you have cover. The idea of being out of range in most cases is going to be kind of going to be beyond the scope of what this is trying to simulate, because modern weapons have a very far effective range. I mean, hell, even bows and crossbows, technically, if you're trained, have more range than they really do in most games. So anyways, the important thing is where you are in a blast when one comes at you. So if there is someone else in the middle, which would make sense that you would line up your blast. So this character now, if we go back through this, if it's a success but no crit, they have to get out of the blast zone. So they don't have to move 2 spaces, but they might have to move 2 depending on where they are. So if this is dead set in the middle, then he has to do the 4 endurance. I see the line has merged with him. Okay. So then he has to spend the 4 endurance to move 1, 2, and he's out. But if he was at the edge of the blast, then you would only have to spend 2 to get out. And likewise, if it's a failure on a blast, then the target, the stick figures, oh, it's like he's been hit already. Look at him. The failure, the target in here, they spend 2 endurance, and they can move 2 spaces for that and get out of the blast. So I guess I should put in here 2 or 1 so that it's understood that this is a fixed cost and that really it's just the idea is that on a success you have to expel more endurance to get out of the way, and then on a failure for the attacker anyways, the shot wasn't that great, so it doesn't take as much energy to avoid getting hit. I'll just point out the system does not model incompetence. So the idea that you would make an attack and that your roll would be so bad that you just fire directly off at a 90-degree angle and completely miss, the system doesn't model that. I'm not interested in modeling character incompetence. This is a resource management game. So failure isn't like you can't aim, it's just that it wasn't good enough aim to guarantee the hit, and the defender had time to get out of the way. So on the last one here, a success and a crit, once again, just like with a single attack, the target, they cannot move, and we roll armor, so they have no chance to avoid it. And that's true for every character inside of this blast that's being targeted. They get to make these decisions, because even though the success should be the same for all of them, success or failure, the crit will not be the same. Some characters in here, because if you get a 10, if you roll a 10, for example, and one target has no stagger, it's not a crit. Another target has 2 stagger, then you crit one target and didn't crit another. So one of them may get caught, and then another one may be able to get out. I will say that these exact values, this might change, but the general idea of getting a success on a hit, your target's going to have to spend some amount of fixed endurance to basically pay for moving. And if you fail, they'll spend half of that to get to move the same distance to get out of the way. And then this is definitely not changing. If you crit on a ranged or a blast, the target inside cannot move and you immediately go to rolling. In this case, since we're modeling modern weapons, armor in the fantasy setting, if you had a psychic blast, then they'd be rolling their mental defense, not armor. But that's a topic for magic. So, now that we've gone over this, now we can kind of get into some of the trigger rolls for a modern game. So, our modern weapon trigger. And a trigger roll is any natural 6 that's rolled, or we can spend focus from our character for one to boost one of the d6s. We can boost it from whatever it is up to a 6. So in this case, if we wanted to make this a 6, we'd have to spend 3 focus. If you wanted to make a 1 a 6, you'd have to spend 5 focus. And then our allies, or other players in the same area, can spend gravitas to do the same thing for us. So they could spend 3 gravitas and make this a 6 for us, or multiple players could spend any number of gravitas and pool it together for 5 to turn this 1 into a 6. And that keeps things moving. So if players want to shorten an encounter and give players, front load players with a bunch of trigger rolls to burn through an encounter faster, you can, but you're paying for it with resources. So if you don't have the supplies to recoup that, or you don't have a plan to work around that, then that could bite you later on in the game. But if you're close to where you want to go or close to ending an adventure and you have some resources left to burn, by all means burn it if you think you can handle the resource loss to get through things quick and just get it over with. So anyways, let's go over some modern weapon trigger rolls. So for firearms, we'll do increased threat of +2. An increased threat, there's 2 different directions you can increase the crit range. You can do it through crit range vectors. So threat is the active character's way to increase it in their favor. And then stagger is the target character. So, threat goes one way and stagger is the opposite. So for example, with this 10 we have here, if we had an increased threat of +2 from this 6, then this would be, it would count as a critical. It wouldn't become a 12, but it would count as a critical hit. Likewise, if we had no increased threat, but the target had 2 stagger, then this 10 would also count as a 12. So between threat and stagger combined, you can turn pretty low d12 rolls into a critical hit, and that is completely on purpose. Because what I've realized about this, and I'll have to make another video about it at some point, is this game is really a bunch of clocks when I think about it. It's a bunch of clocks that interact with each other, but one thing that doesn't change, they're all counting down to 0. Because there's no real way, nor do I intend there for be a way, to recover resources permanently mid-encounter. You can temporarily recover them, like healing in the game, and this would be true for fantasy and sci-fi and whatever other genre, healing is always only going to cause temporary endurance to give you some buffer, but that's not free. Either it's going to come from an item that'll be consumed when you use it, so you're not going to have an infinite amount of them. It's going to, in the form of magic, in sword and sorcery, healing will generate corruption for the caster using it, and they'll be able to weather some of that corruption, and then maybe they'll have some mana that they can spend to reduce the corruption, but that's not something that they're going to be able to do infinitely, install something out forever. So your endurance is going to run out because every time there's a check made in a dangerous situation, someone's losing endurance. Even on a failed check, you're always going to lose some. Typically, it's half the damage of a melee weapon. In ranged, it'll just have these fixed values for avoiding it. And we'll see. I'm not like completely. I'm not going to die on the hill for these endurance values. Will have to be play tested, but the relationship between them and the spaces isn't going to change. You'll spend a certain amount of endurance, a higher amount if you get a success on you, and you'll spend half that if the check is a failure. And then this is of course inverted for defense because the game's always going to be player facing roles, and that's not changing no matter what genre you're in. All right, what else can firearms do? Let's see, threat. Do increased pen 1. So this way, what we can do is if we spend enough points, so if we had 2 6s here, so if we spend 3 focus to make this a 6 in this hypothetical roll, we could spend the first 6 for the increased threat to make this a 12 to crit. Now that we've crit, we're going to want some more penetration on our weapon. So this 3 that we just converted, now it is +1 pen, so it'll have an extra dice for rolling against the target's armor. And then and I think that's good for firearms. There could be more later, depending on ammo types. Like if you had incendiary rounds, a la Mass Effect 1, or disruption rounds, again with the Mass Effect, if you're using shields, then your trigger rolls could inflict burning, toxic rounds inflicts poison, shrapnel rounds, bleeding, whatever you want to do. Trigger rolls, they're supposed to just be all the cool gimmicky things to kind of tweak the different levers of the game. That's what trigger rolls are. So melee, we're gonna go a little crazy with melee because going back to the beginning statement, the goal is to shoot. Melee is rare but powerful. We're gonna give melee an increased threat of +4. And we'll give it an increased penetration of +2. Or basically, melee is double the trigger roll value of firearms. And then for the actual firearm itself, rifle, let's see, we were saying 15 here earlier, so this is late, but and this is another thing I always enjoy. So knowing the stat rating of 5, we can calculate the physical success. 20 minus the stat rating gives us 15, and then 5 times the rating gives us our physique resource of endurance. 25, there we go. And then debating if I want to go over proficiencies. Not really. Proficiencies, we're just going to say that this character, when we go through the video here, it's just going to have a +1 proficiency to do things, whatever it is that they're doing. So prof +1, and then let's give them armor 46. And we're not going to worry about physical, mental, or energy. We're just going to worry about, kinetic warfare. Just going to worry about weapons and armor. What else here? All right, so I think we're good on that. Rifle. I'm debating if I want to worry about sizes, because sizes are matter in fantasy, since if you're stronger, you can wield a bigger sword. So that's something to think about for this. I think there will be sizes for rifles, but that's really going to be more of a standardized thing to represent, like if you're wielding a minigun, you'll need to have physique, or you'll need to be wearing equipment that kind of boosts your physique rating for the purposes of carrying larger sized weapons. But that's we won't worry about size because I don't think it's going to have a direct relationship on this. So ranged weapons, so we know we're using the ranged rules up here and not melee rules for this. Why? Okay, autocorrect. And we'll say the caliber of this gives it 3d6 penetration. Some things, and then we'll go wild with this. So if you use your rifle to melee bash, we'll just say that it's a size 5 rifle. So it'll do 5 damage to endurance, but the real kicker for melee bash, the pen is 1d6, so you're almost never going to kill somebody with this. You could even make it 0d6 and just say it's impossible to actually kill someone with a melee bash if you want to for a sci-fi game. But what it does do, the point of the attack does some endurance, but that's not the kicker. The kicker is stagger +4. And I think we'll go back to the footage. We'll see if anyone actually uses a melee bash with a rifle, but it's always a massive blow to somebody, and they stagger back, and you have a huge opportunity to kind of do whatever you want. All right, we'll copy this and knife. And we'll go kind of crazy on the knife. Melee. And this is where things get a little interesting, because the knife is technically, we'll just say that it's size 1 to keep things interesting. But the size of a weapon and the penetration and value of a weapon, for melee, they're not related. For ranged weapons, for bows and crossbows and sword and sorcery, there's a relationship between the size and the pen, since those weapons rely upon the draw, basically the poundage and the draw length of the bowstring to generate it. So a bigger bow is going to have more penetration, and a bigger crossbow. Well, the crossbow's relationship between penetration is between that and their reload speed, and then the reload speed is a relationship to their size. So you can figure all that out. Basically, once you know one of the numbers, you can figure out the rest once you know how it's calculated. Anyways, as I said, tangents. nesting these a little bit. Okay, so, well, there's our weapons, there's our character. Let's get everything over here. Okay. We don't need that anymore. Really, we don't need the drawing anymore either. Farewell, stick figure land. Flatland. Alright, so now that we have this established, let's finally begin the video.
10 seconds.
Alright, so free play, we're in free play, still. Now, once we jump, we're now have entered a structured scene, and the GM, so it's a structured scene when the GM decides to spend a threat to have the character make a reaction roll. And I think this is definitely a time to do something like that. So, and the roll is to skydive. Skydive and land. So we're just gonna one roll for both. Basically, how taxing is this jump gonna be? We have the right equipment on, so I don't think this atmosphere. There's no. I mean, we'll go through here. So they have the right equipment on. Even though there's lightning and stuff, it doesn't look like the characters themselves, other than the fall itself, are in any particular immediate danger. Like, the lightning's not hitting the characters, so even though that storm looks scary, it's not like it's for show. So we'll say the storm, as an NPC, it is a rating of 3. So by our equation here, we know that the storm is a resource value of 15, and it's an NPC, so it doesn't make checks. Only PCs make checks. We will say, though, that the let's see, turbulent. The storm is a little turbulent, so we'll say it's +1. It imposes +1 disadvantage on our PC here for navigating it. So now that we've called the reaction roll, I'll go back and roll again on Discord, and it's going to be the same roll because we're not modeling all of our proficiencies. We're just saying that the one that we're going to be using throughout this whole example is +1. So it's the same dice pool of 1d12 plus 3d6. And we got a 10, 5, 2, 1. All right, so some interesting things. So we passed 18, higher than 15, so there's no danger there. We got a 10 on the D12, so there's no critical hit to the player. We don't have any stagger, and there's no threat that the storm has on us. But we did get a 1. So the 1 does give the GM a trigger roll against the player. Because you can think of a reaction roll as the GM rolling. It's just that you're still rolling it, so there's some things that are inverted because of that. So critical hits happen on a 1 on the D12, and trigger rolls happen on a 1 on one of your extra dice. Oh, and I realized that I actually didn't factor in the disadvantage because I didn't roll a d4. So this might make it confusing, but just forget that I ever mentioned the disadvantage since I didn't factor it into the dice roll in the first place. So that's my bad. Maybe disadvantage will come up at some point. Anyways, even if we had the disadvantage, it might not have mattered because we had a 2 and a 1. So, anyways, trying to get on track here. So what the GM could do with this trigger roll is they could say that, as they're diving down through the storm, a bit of turbulence hits them and they have to strain themselves a bit more than they were expecting to stay on course. So what we'll do is we'll treat the storm draining the character as if it were a melee attack, which means it does damage to endurance based on the rating of the NPC. We're going to use the trigger roll to simulate that turbulence as a power attack, basically, which does the rating damage again. All right, so we're going to be doing 6 damage to endurance. However, the PC did pass the check, so any endurance loss is automatically halved. So if the PC didn't get this 1 and we weren't able to burn a trigger roll against the PC, then it would have basically been 3 cut in half. I'll have to codify whether in this situation the GM rounds up or down, but either way it would have been 1 or 2 depending on if we end up rounding up or down for that, which, I mean, you take it, but that's basically nothing. So getting this trigger roll is nice because even though the total is going to get cut in half, you still did something to the PC. So now we're down to 22. And there's another thing here. We'll say that the PC has a load of 15 between all the armor and gear and stuff. So that's the number to kind of watch out for. All right. So now that we have landed, there's the reaction roll. You could even say, the impact there was the power attack. It doesn't matter. The whole point is the game tells you what happened mechanically, and then it's up to you as the table to kind of toss out ideas if you want about what those trigger rolls are representing. But you have the mechanical tools to represent it.
Copy. On the move.
Tracking 2 targets below. Boost down, take them out.
All right, so 2 targets below, boost down and take them out. So in this case, even though we're dropping again, this is actually, the players are even though I guess you could say that they chose to jump out of that helicopter or whatever, the dropship, to get down here in the first place, them going down, they don't have a ton of control over being in the atmosphere itself. And I'll remind that the GM spent a threat to force them to make that reaction roll in the first time. So in this case, the PCs, they're making the choice to jump down here. So they're going to be making a check because they're basically doing, old mech warrior, a death from above maneuver, jumping down, melee weapon, and attacking. So this is a proactive row. All right, let's see what they get. And I think you could easily make an argument here I think you could definitely make a strong case to say, hey, can I get +1 advantage for this? I'm literally dropping on top of this dude's head. So advantage, as a reminder, and for anyone jumping right into the middle of the system talks here, turns to 1d8. So now our roll, no, not 1d81. What even is a d81? Our total roll, because of the advantage, has turned from 1d12 3d6 into 1d12 plus 1d8 plus 2d6. And what do we get here? All right, so we got a 5, 6, 4, 4. Pretty good. All right, so now we as the PCs, it's a proactive role. We can spend focus and gravitas. And I didn't give us a focus, so let's do that real quick. We'll even set it low. Focus of 4. That means we know the focus success is 16. Sorry, focus is the resource. Five times 4 is 20. All right, so we have perception rating of 4, so we know the success is 16, so we know our focus is 20. So now we have some stuff to work with. And we'll avoid adding persona to the mix. I don't think we're going to need the third stat, but you could easily see once we go through this how you add on that third stat and then you have a team some extra levers to pull on. So anyways, let's give ourselves, let's juice this up a lot so we can actually do what they do in the video, which is kick him, stab him, he's dead. All right, so that's a one-hit kill. But we can model these things with this roll. So let's see here. So first they knocked him prone. All right, so let's go through this. Let's spend 1 focus to make this 5 into a 6. And you might wonder, well, how do you determine like that you can do that? And I would say this is where you have to, man, this does not want to, I guess it's because it's in, we need to make this thinner. Oh man, it's growing. There we go. Okay. All right. So target knock prone for the first trigger roll. We've spent 1 focus. You can use, and this is where the narrative or fiction can influence the mechanics. You can say, I'm dropping down. I dropped down 40 feet and then landed right on top of this dude. You know I hit him. You know I succeeded. I got a 19. I only needed a 15. So there's no question that you hit him. Oh, I made a mistake. Because that 5 is the D12 roll. So we don't have to spend focus for that. We'll just use the D8 roll was the 6. All right. Sorry. So you can say trigger roll. I want to knock him prone because landing right on top of him. Now, he's not going to live long enough for prone to matter, but you don't know in the game yet if you're going to be able to kill him in one hit with your melee attack. You plan on it, but you don't know for sure. So you're knocking him prone is sort of an insurance policy to kind of guarantee any follow up to him goes smoothly. So the next we have 2 4s. So what do we have for our we know we're using our knife. What do we have for our trigger roll options? Increased threat +4. So this guy isn't staggered yet. He will be after this attack. But what do we have? We have a 5 and we need a 12. So let's begin juicing. So we're going to turn both of these 4s into 6s by spending 4 focus. And we'll go down to 16. All right, so we'll spend both of these. So we spent 2 focus and 2 focus for a total of 4 to turn both of these 4s into 6s for 2 more trigger rolls. Each of them we're going to pump into boosting threat by +4 each. Because just boosting it once isn't going to be enough to get it to make this into a crit. So we're going to boost it by +8. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. All right, we have over 12 on the 5 now, which is fine. So we've critically hit him. So now we move on to the penetration check. And we'll say these NPCs armor. This is where it gets a little interesting because we already have a new NPC. I mean, the sky is still technically there, but anyways. Uh, resources 15. All right, so let's see. So let's go through the guard. The knife is a size 1, so we know we did 1 damage to endurance, so he's at 14 endurance because of that. We'll say he just has 2d6 armor. It's probably not realistic for the actual game, but it will be a problem if this dice roll fails. So just to be upfront about that. So guards, whenever you assign armor to them or penetration to them, you can assign it in dice rolls, and then it's just 3 points per roll. So he has 6 armor. There's 3 plus 3. It's kind of slanted on the low end on purpose. But if you wanted to make a stronger NPC, you could give them 4 for the average, which will make their armor higher and make them a bit harder to wound. But this is just a mook. So armor of 6. We have our crit. We know our penetration is 46, so let's roll 46. All right, we got a 6. Oh man, this is a bad day for this guy, but we rolled really low. So we got a 10. So the 10 greater than 6, we've caused a wound. And most NPCs in this game just have one wound. So now in the game,
Sarge,
we
stay
have proven that they're dead.
1-1 to Reaper. Set that gun.
And I want to point out, I know this, we've only gotten a couple minutes into it. We're probably not going to go through the whole thing. But I hope people don't take away from this that this is a complicated process, even though it might seem like it. It's just because I'm stopping to explain the rules and logic behind them that this is taking a while. I think if you were to run through this example, it really wouldn't take that much longer to roll through this encounter if you're moving quickly and once people get the hang of the system, to kind of run through it almost as fast as the video itself is playing.
Troops in contact.
Copy, overlay. Out.
Let's get to the weapon before they do.
All right. So that guy came around the corner, and then one of the other players. So in this situation, depending on how the GM has things set up, in this case, it almost seems like these would be, now of course it's video games, this is true, but pre-planned enemies. So if the GM had an enemy and the player saw it, so the enemy didn't ambush us, then the PC could make a proactive check to do this whole jump attack sequence. And right there, so that was one attack with his knife. You saw again how we could go through this whole roll thing again. We're not going to, but the player got a roll, spent a trigger roll to knock him prone, spent trigger rolls to increase the threat value, and then once again rolled good on the armor penetration because we made our knife ridiculous on purpose. Going back to melee should be rare but powerful. So if you can get in melee, you're more likely to cause that penetration. It doesn't matter that the knife is size 1 and that it doesn't really do any damage to endurance. Because did this guy expend any energy? Did he burn? Was he fighting for his life? No, he got knocked over and then knifed. So, I mean, technically he had full endurance, basically. -1 from the knife. But that's kind of how the system models your kind of stamina to protect yourself from injury, and going up to the single shot and blast rules, moving out of the way of attacks versus your armor, which protects you when an attack actually lands and hits you. So let's see here. Let's get to at least some shooting.
Keep moving. Reaper, we're approaching the entry point. Be advised, we've encountered steady SDF presence.
Thermal is spotty at your depth, so stay alert.
Stand fast. Sentries on the roof. Wolf, take one, we got the others.
Okay. Player fired. So the GM didn't spend any... So we have a couple rolls to go back through. This was an 18. So technically... I actually think I did the whole jump sequence incorrectly. But that's neither here nor there. I guess technically the way that the jump sequence should have worked is it should have actually been a proactive roll, and then the player should have been doing a stat rating based on the proficiency that they rolled in terms of quote-unquote damage to the storm to represent the progression through the storm, if that makes sense. Because everything is supposed to be uniform in the system. Diving, confronting a storm should not be different in terms of the raw mechanics to interacting with a guard. So I didn't do that right. So hopefully the next time I do an explanation, I get it right. But anyways, let's go through what we just saw here with the headshot. So we go back to, I guess what I was saying is this 18 did not generate threat. It was an even roll, so the players maintained the control of the scene. This 19, however, generated GM threat, but in this case, if a GM was running the scene, the players got to this area and they saw everything. Everything was in plain view, so they didn't have to make a check to observe anything, although they could have if they'd wanted to. But they saw everything they wanted to see, and they didn't want to possibly lose the initiative in terms of making a check to observe the area. You know, they're not like, they're not pulling out binoculars, for example, and like scanning off in the corners here. They're not like looking at this ship. They're just saying, the GM is saying, okay, you see this bunker coming out of the permafrost, and there's 4 guards walking on the top of it. And so the players are like, okay, let's just go. And they immediately say, okay, we're gonna shoot them. So the first player goes, uses their firearm, makes the check. Whether or not they would have advantage in this situation, I think is going to depend on the nuts and bolts of the mechanical framework you build around your shooter. So does this holographic sight give advantage? Maybe. It kind of depends on the rules of the system you kind of agree to beforehand. Because these types of questions are not going to be answered by the core engine here, because this core engine is completely agnostic to any genre. So these types of details are something you would know before you were playing, but in this example, I think we could say that this holographic sight, I mean, is it magnifying? How is this thing even working? That's like holographic plus zoom. That sight's actually insane. I don't think I've ever seen a holographic sight. Wait. Is it... What is happening here? It also magnified... So the sight isn't actually magnifying... It's... Okay, so when you go into the site, it actually magnifies literally everything that even isn't in the site itself. That's hilarious. Not how that works at all, but for the purposes of the game and making it easier just to get the shot, I understand why they did it from a pure gameplay perspective. But anyways, we'll say that once again, we have gear, we have equipment advantage. And I'm just going to say this is one advantage, equipment and situation, because I think you could make an argument that this site only gives you advantage when you're not already in combat or you have cover. So the character here does not have cover. They're in the open. One of these guys might have cover for future fights. So the site advantage, you'd only get it for just this opening shot, and then you'd need to get in cover to regain this. Otherwise, you're just going to be hip firing, or you're going to be too stressed to really take advantage of lining up a perfect shot like this. So I'm going to pop back to Discord here. Once again, we have a 1d12 plus 1d8 plus 2d6. We'll copy this, and then we'll punch in the new numbers that we get. Ooh, this is interesting. Okay, our first genuinely interesting roll. All right, so this roll might actually force reality to be different from the video, since we got a 1. But because this is a proactive roll, the 1's just a 1. Getting a 1 on a d12 on a proactive roll, it's just a low roll. And in this case, it definitely did not help. We only got a 12. So, although we failed this, we can start tapping into focus to boost things. So first, even though this really hurts, and I don't know if I don't know if I would make this decision in the actual game, but spending 4 focus to turn this 2 into a 6. So the 1 is a 1, so we've turned you into a 6. So we've passed now, but let's see what else we can do. We've already committed to burning focus for this, so let's just keep going. So we're going to burn another 3 focus and get 2 more 6s. It's already down to 9 focus. So unless this is a short mission, burning focus this fast, you can see it definitely gets lit on fire if you try to boost every single roll every time to a 6. So our success value doesn't really matter at this point. We've boosted it. We're good. We have 3 trigger rolls. Let's see what we can do. And the funny thing is, I don't actually think we can recover this, because even if we did 2, 4, and 6, that only gets us up to a 7, which isn't a critical hit. So we actually, just because of this roll, funny enough, we can't actually replicate what just happened here. But you could easily imagine that you got, with 3 trigger rolls, you could potentially, you have like a 50% chance basically of this being a number which could have been boosted to be a crit to make that penetration check to try to get that headshot like we just saw. And so the even odd is just off of the original roll, because I don't want people to like not boost rolls to get trigger rolls based on this. And it's something that I might change after playtesting. I might say that you can spend resources to make trigger rolls, but they don't change whether or not you passed or failed. That might be something that we do, because it might be a little trivial in the long run if you can just turn every failure into a success, whereas if you get a failure, so you do half your normal amount of rating, but then you still have trigger rolls to kind of boost up things to, cause displacement, knock people prone, increase threat. You could still kind of use those triggers on a failed check to turn it into something that's still kind of effective. So this is kind of where our little thought experiment has deviated from the reality of the video. And really, the way this gun's operating with these rules, it's basically what you have. It's almost like you're just getting a ton of free threat with every shot. But anyways, you can see how even without, we've already kind of juiced these up a bit, but you can see how even with pretty reasonable setup to the kind of base game, how we can use this system to kind of influence the fiction in a way with a pretty minimal rule structure and just being able to derive so much information off of one stat. All right, so I think I'll wrap up the video here, but I hope that this little thought experiment was interesting. It was fun for me to think about last night, and decided to kind of do a video about it to try to put some context for the nuts and bolts of how the game works.